The small town of Millfield, Indiana, stood as a testament to America's westward expansion in 1850. Nestled between rolling hills and fertile farmland, the settlement had grown from a handful of determined pioneers to a community of nearly 800 souls. White clapboard houses dotted the landscape, surrounded by fields of wheat and corn that swayed in the gentle autumn breeze. The town's central church spire reached toward heaven like a silent prayer, its bell marking the rhythm of daily life in this frontier settlement. In one of these modest homes at the edge of town, 13-year-old Eleanor Blackwood sat at her bedroom window, watching as the late September sun began its descent toward the horizon. The waning light cast long shadows across the wooden floor, painting the walls with hues of amber and gold. Eleanor's slender fingers traced patterns on the glass, her blue eyes reflecting the dying light of day. She'd been feeling strange since morning, a persistent pressure behind her eyes, a heaviness in her chest that made each breath feel laborious. "Eleanor," called her mother from downstairs, "come help with supper." The girl rose from her seat by the window, smoothing the fabric of her simple cotton dress. As she took a step toward the door, a sharp pain lanced through her head, forcing her to clutch the bedpost for support. The room seemed to tilt beneath her feet, the familiar surroundings suddenly foreign and unstable. "I'm coming," she managed to reply, her voice barely above a whisper. She made it halfway down the narrow staircase before another wave of pain struck, this time accompanied by an uncomfortable warmth behind her eyes. Eleanor gripped the handrail, her knuckles turning white with the effort to remain upright. When she reached the bottom step, her mother turned from the stove, a look of concern immediately replacing her expectant expression. "Child, what's the matter? You're pale as death." Margaret Blackwood crossed the kitchen in 3 quick strides, reaching her daughter just as Eleanor's legs began to buckle. Outside, the sun touched the horizon, its final rays streaming through the kitchen window in a blaze of crimson light. It was at that precise moment, as the sun met the earth in its daily surrender, that the first drop of blood appeared. It formed at the corner of Eleanor's right eye, swelling like a ruby teardrop before tracing a vivid path down her pale cheek. Margaret watched in horror as more droplets followed, first from one eye, then from both, creating twin trails of scarlet against her daughter's skin. "Thomas!" she screamed for her husband, who was finishing his work in the small barn behind their home. "Thomas, come quick!" Eleanor seemed unaware of the blood that now stained the collar of her dress. Her eyes had rolled back, showing only the whites beneath partially closed lids. Her breathing became deep and rhythmic, her body swaying slightly as if moved by an unseen force. Then, as her parents watched in stunned disbelief, Eleanor began to speak, not in her familiar voice, but in a deeper, measured tone. The words that flowed from her lips were not English, but Latin, precise and fluid, as if she'd spoken the ancient language all her life. "Pater noster, qui es in caelis, sanctificatur nomen tuum." Thomas Blackwood burst through the door, his work-worn hands still covered in soil from the fields. He froze at the sight of his daughter, blood streaming from her eyes, reciting the Lord's Prayer in perfect Latin, a language neither he nor any member of his family had ever studied or understood. "Dear God in heaven," he whispered, instinctively making the sign of the cross. "What's happening to our child?" Margaret cradled Eleanor's face between her trembling hands, trying to stem the flow of blood with her apron. "I don't know," she said, her voice breaking. "She was fine all day, just complained of a headache after church." For 7 minutes, the exact time it took for the sun to disappear completely below the horizon, Eleanor continued to bleed and pray. The Latin phrases poured forth in an unbroken stream, her voice never faltering despite the blood that occasionally seeped into the corner of her mouth. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The final words died on Eleanor's lips as her eyes closed completely. Her body went limp in her mother's arms, the bleeding ceased, and the only evidence of the terrifying episode was the crimson stains on her dress and her mother's apron. "Eleanor?" Margaret whispered, gently patting her daughter's cheek. "Can you hear me?" The girl's eyes fluttered open, once again the clear blue that her parents recognized. She looked confused, taking in the horrified expressions on her parents' faces and the blood on her mother's hands. "What happened?" she asked, her voice small and frightened. "Why are you looking at me like that?" Thomas and Margaret exchanged glances, a silent communication born from 20 years of marriage. "You had a spell of some kind," Thomas said carefully. "Do you remember anything at all?" Eleanor shook her head, wincing at a lingering pain behind her eyes. "I was coming down for supper, and then nothing." She touched her cheek, her fingers coming away red. "Is this blood? Am I bleeding?" "Yes, child," Margaret said, helping Eleanor to a chair. "From your eyes. And you were speaking words we didn't understand." Fear flickered across Eleanor's face. "Was I saying strange things? I don't remember any of it." Thomas knelt beside his daughter, his weathered hands enclosing her small ones. "You were praying, Eleanor, in Latin." The girl's brow furrowed. "But I don't know Latin. How could I possibly—" "We don't know," Margaret interrupted, already moving to heat water for cleaning her daughter's face. "But we'll figure it out. You just rest now." As the night settled over the Blackwood home, none of them could have known that this was merely the beginning, that each Sunday at sunset for the months to come, Eleanor would bleed from her eyes and pray in perfect Latin, becoming an unwitting vessel for words and knowledge that should have been far beyond her reach. The town doctor would be summoned the next day. The local pastor would follow. And within weeks, word of the strange affliction would spread beyond the boundaries of Millfield, drawing the curious, the faithful, and the skeptical alike to witness the girl who bled from her eyes every Sunday at sunset, praying in Latin while unconscious, a medical mystery and spiritual enigma in the heart of frontier Indiana. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. You won't want to miss a single moment of these authentic, emotionally powerful historical stories that reveal the hidden depths of human experience and resilience. By the following morning, Eleanor showed no physical signs of her strange episode. The blood had been washed away, and her eyes appeared normal, the same clear blue that had always gazed back at her from her mother's hand mirror. Yet something had fundamentally changed in the Blackwood household. A heavy silence hung in the air as Margaret prepared breakfast, casting frequent worried glances at her daughter. "I feel fine, Mother," Eleanor assured her, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. Perhaps it was just a strange occurrence that won't happen again. Thomas Blackwood had already ridden into town before dawn, determined to bring back Dr. Samuel Harrington, Millfield's only physician. A Harvard-educated man who had moved west seeking opportunity, Dr. Harrington had established himself as a progressive medical mind in a place where folk remedies and superstition still held considerable sway. Shortly before noon, the sound of approaching horses announced their arrival. Eleanor sat nervously by the window, watching as her father helped the doctor down from his horse. Behind them rode a third figure, the tall, austere form of Reverend Michael Collins, the Presbyterian minister who had led the Millfield congregation for nearly a decade. "Why is Reverend Collins here?" Eleanor asked, her fingers nervously pleating the fabric of her dress. Margaret sighed, placing a reassuring hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Your father thought it best to consult both medicine and faith in this matter." The men entered the house, removing their hats as they crossed the threshold. Dr. Harrington immediately approached Eleanor, his kind eyes examining her with professional interest. "Good day, Miss Blackwood," he said, setting his medical bag on the table. "Your father has told me of your unusual experience yesterday. I'd like to examine you if I may." For the next half hour, the doctor performed a thorough examination, checking Eleanor's eyes, ears, and throat, measuring her pulse, and asking detailed questions about her health history. Reverend Collins stood quietly in the corner, occasionally making notes in a small leather-bound book. "Have you ever studied Latin, Eleanor?" the minister finally asked, his voice gentle but probing. "No, Reverend," she replied. "I've only ever learned what Miss Abernathy teaches at the school, reading, writing, arithmetic, and some history." "And yet your father says you recited the Lord's Prayer in perfect Latin." The minister exchanged glances with the doctor. "That's quite remarkable." Dr. Harrington closed his medical bag with a contemplative sigh. "Physically, I can find nothing wrong with the girl. Her eyes show no irritation or damage that would explain the bleeding. Her pulse is strong, lungs clear. He turned to Thomas and Margaret. Has Eleanor ever experienced seizures or fainting spells before? Never, Margaret answered firmly. She's always been a healthy child, hardly even catches cold in winter. The doctor nodded, stroking his beard thoughtfully. There are rare conditions of the blood vessels that might explain the bleeding, but they typically don't appear and disappear so suddenly. And they certainly don't come with recitations in ancient languages. Could it be? Thomas hesitated, lowering his voice. Something not of the body, but of the spirit? Reverend Collins stepped forward. If you're asking whether I believe your daughter is possessed, Mr. Blackwood, I cannot say with certainty. The Presbyterian faith approaches such matters with caution, but I would like to be present next Sunday at sunset to witness this phenomenon firsthand. As would I, added Dr. Harrington. Medical science advances through observation. If this episode repeats as you've described, seeing it with my own eyes will be invaluable. Eleanor, who had remained silent during this discussion of her condition, suddenly spoke up. Am I going to die? The question hung in the air, stark and frightening in its simplicity. Dr. Harrington knelt before her, taking her hands in his. No, Eleanor. I don't believe this condition is fatal. Unusual, certainly, perhaps even unique, but not necessarily dangerous. We will help you understand what's happening, Reverend Collins added. Between science and faith, we will find answers. The week that followed was tense with anticipation. Word of Eleanor's strange affliction began to spread through Millfield, despite the Blackwoods' attempts at discretion. Neighbors who had known Eleanor since birth now regarded her with a mixture of concern and barely concealed curiosity. At school, her classmates whispered behind their hands as she passed, some making furtive signs to ward off evil. Eleanor tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, but the weight of what might happen on Sunday pressed upon her constantly. She found herself watching the sun with newfound anxiety, counting the days until it would again disappear behind the western hills. By Saturday night, Margaret noticed that Eleanor had barely touched her supper. You need to keep up your strength, she encouraged, pushing the plate closer to her daughter. I'm scared, Mother, Eleanor admitted, her voice small. What if it's worse this time? What if I say terrible things? Margaret pulled her daughter into a tight embrace. We'll be right beside you no matter what happens. Dr. Harrington and Reverend Collins will be here too. Between medicine and prayer, we'll find a way through this. Sunday arrived with a sky of perfect blue, unmarred by clouds. A beautiful day that seemed to mock the dread that had settled over the Blackwood home. By mid-afternoon, Dr. Harrington and Reverend Collins had arrived, setting up a small table with medical equipment and religious texts, preparing to document whatever might occur. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Eleanor sat in the center of the parlor, her parents flanking her on either side. The doctor checked her pulse one last time, noting its elevated rate in his journal. It's nearly time, Reverend Collins said quietly, watching the sun through the window. Are you ready, Eleanor? She nodded, though her pale face and trembling hands belied her brave facade. Will it hurt again? She asked the doctor. I don't know, Dr. Harrington answered honestly, but we're here to help you through it. The minutes crawled by. Outside, the sun touched the horizon, bathing the room in the same crimson light that had preceded Eleanor's first episode. Everyone watched her intently, the silence broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock. Then, precisely as the lower edge of the sun disappeared from view, Eleanor gasped. Her back arched sharply, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. The pressure behind her eyes returned with savage intensity, and within seconds, the first drops of blood appeared, perfect crimson spheres that balanced momentarily before tracing familiar paths down her cheeks. Fascinating, whispered Dr. Harrington, leaning forward to observe more closely. The blood appears to be emerging directly from the tear ducts, not from any visible wound. Reverend Collins had opened his Bible, watching with a mixture of scientific curiosity and spiritual caution. As before, Eleanor's eyes rolled back, showing only the whites. Her breathing deepened, and her body began the same subtle swaying motion. Then the Latin began, flowing from her lips in the same measured, unfamiliar voice. In principio erat verbum, et verbum erat apud Deum, et Deus erat verbum. The Gospel of John, Reverend Collins translated quietly, his pen moving rapidly across his notebook. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. For exactly 7 minutes, again matching the time it took for the sun to completely disappear, Eleanor continued reciting the ancient text. The blood flowed steadily, staining the clean white cloth Margaret had placed in her daughter's lap in anticipation. Dr. Harrington moved methodically around Eleanor, checking her pulse, examining her eyes with a small magnifying glass, and making detailed notes. Pulse elevated but steady, pupils non-responsive to light, no apparent awareness of surroundings. As the last sliver of sun vanished, Eleanor's recitation ended abruptly on the word lux, light. Her body slumped forward, and for a terrifying moment, she did not breathe. Then, with a shuddering gasp, she drew air into her lungs and slowly opened her eyes, once again conscious and present. "Did it happen again?" she asked weakly, touching her blood-stained cheeks. "Yes, my dear," Reverend Collins said gently. "You recited the first chapter of the Gospel of John in perfect Latin." Eleanor shook her head in confusion. "I don't remember any of it. The last thing I recall is watching the sun begin to set." Dr. Harrington helped Margaret clean the blood from Eleanor's face, his expression thoughtful. "This is not a typical medical condition," he said finally. "The precision of timing, exactly at sunset, lasting exactly 7 minutes, suggests something beyond ordinary pathology." "Could it be divine intervention?" Thomas asked, looking to the minister. "Is God speaking through our daughter?" Reverend Collins closed his Bible slowly. "I hesitate to make such a pronouncement. Throughout history, there have been cases of individuals manifesting unusual abilities or knowledge during states of altered consciousness. Some were indeed considered divine messengers, others were later found to have medical explanations. Or, Dr. Harrington added carefully, there have been instances of influence by less benevolent forces." A heavy silence fell over the room. The implication hung in the air, unspoken but understood by all. Possession. "No," Margaret said firmly, pulling Eleanor closer to her side. "I won't accept that. My daughter is a good, God-fearing child. If some force is using her as a vessel, it cannot be evil, not when it speaks the Holy Scripture." "I agree," Reverend Collins said after a moment's consideration. "The content of Eleanor's recitations has been sacred text, delivered without distortion or malice. If this is indeed a spiritual phenomenon, it does not appear to be malevolent in nature." Dr. Harrington packed his instruments slowly. "I propose we continue to observe and document these episodes. If they maintain this pattern, occurring only at sunset on Sundays, we can prepare more thoroughly next week." "And if they worsen?" Thomas asked, giving voice to their collective fear. "Then we will face that challenge when it comes," the doctor replied. "For now, Eleanor appears to recover completely after each episode, with no lasting physical effects." As the men prepared to leave, promising to return the following Sunday, Eleanor caught the sleeve of Reverend Collins's coat. "Reverend," she asked, her voice trembling slightly, "why me? Why is this happening to me?" The minister regarded her thoughtfully, choosing his words with care. "Throughout history, God has chosen unlikely messengers, shepherds, fishermen, children. I cannot tell you with certainty why this is happening, Eleanor, but I can tell you that you are not alone in facing it. Your family, this community, and God Himself stand with you." After they had gone, Eleanor sat by the window of her bedroom, staring at the night sky where stars now punctuated the darkness. The episode had left her feeling drained but curiously peaceful. Whatever was happening to her body during those 7 minutes, her spirit seemed untouched by it, preserved in some quiet place beyond her conscious reach. As she drifted toward sleep, a thought formed in her mind with surprising clarity. This was only the beginning. Something had awakened within her, or perhaps had awakened her to its presence, and the bleeding eyes and Latin prayers were merely the first manifestations of a mystery that would ultimately transform not only her life, but the lives of all who witnessed it. By the third Sunday, word of Eleanor's condition had spread beyond the boundaries of Millfield. What had begun as whispered conversations among neighbors had evolved into something more substantial, a story compelling enough to draw visitors from neighboring towns and even from as far as Indianapolis. Thomas Blackwood stood on his porch that afternoon, watching with growing concern as wagons and riders made their way down the narrow dirt road toward his property. Men in Sunday suits, women in their best dresses, and even families with children, all coming to witness what many were now calling the miracle of Millfield. "This cannot continue," he said to Margaret as she joined him at the door. "Our home is not a public spectacle." Margaret squeezed his arm gently. "Dr. Harrington and Reverend Collins advised us to allow some observers. They believe having educated witnesses will help understand what's happening to Eleanor." "Yes, a few learned men, not half the county." Thomas gestured toward the approaching crowd. "Some of these people have traveled for days. What do they expect to see?" Inside, Eleanor sat at her bedroom window, watching the procession with a mixture of curiosity and dread. At 13, she was old enough to understand the implications of her condition, but too young to fully grasp why it fascinated others so deeply. Over the past week, she had tried to prepare herself mentally for another episode, though the memory of pain and the strange disconnection from her own body remained frightening. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. It was Reverend Collins, his tall frame slightly stooped as he entered the small bedroom. "Good afternoon, Eleanor," he said kindly. "How are you feeling today?" "Nervous," she admitted. "There are so many people coming." The minister nodded, taking a seat on the wooden chair beside her bed. "Your father has agreed to allow only a small number inside, primarily those who might help us understand your condition. Dr. Harrington has invited a colleague from the medical college in Indianapolis, and I've asked Professor Whitman from the seminary to join us." "And the others?" Eleanor asked, glancing again at the growing crowd outside. "They will wait in the yard. Your father and some men from the church will ensure they remain respectful." He studied her face carefully. "How much do you remember from last Sunday?" Eleanor shook her head. "Nothing from during the episode, but afterward, I felt different. Like something had been opened inside me that I didn't know was there before." "Opened?" The minister leaned forward, intrigued. "Can you describe that feeling?" She considered his question, her young face solemn with the effort to articulate something beyond her experience. "It's like when you enter a room you've never been in before, but somehow you know there are doors leading to other rooms beyond it. I can feel those doors now, even though I can't open them myself." Reverend Collins made a note in his journal. "That's very insightful, Eleanor. Have you had any unusual dreams this week, or moments where you felt the presence of something else?" "I dreamed of a building," she said softly. "A massive structure of white stone with columns and domes. People in robes were walking up its steps. I've never seen such a place before, but in the dream, it felt familiar." "A temple, perhaps," the minister murmured. "Or a cathedral?" He made another note, then closed his journal. "Dr. Harrington will want to examine you before sunset. Will you be ready?" Eleanor nodded bravely. "I want to understand what's happening to me as much as everyone else does." Downstairs, the house was being prepared for the evening's observation. The furniture in the parlor had been arranged to provide Eleanor a central seat, with chairs positioned strategically for the principal observers. Thomas had reluctantly allowed a local photographer to set up his equipment in one corner. The man had offered a significant sum for the privilege of documenting the event, money the Blackwood family desperately needed after a poor harvest. By 6 o'clock, the small group of official observers had assembled in the parlor. Besides Dr. Harrington and Reverend Collins, there was Dr. James Wilson from the Indianapolis Medical College, Professor Edward Whitman from the Presbyterian Seminary, and Mrs. Abigail Winters, Eleanor's schoolteacher who had insisted on being present to support her pupil. In the yard outside, nearly 100 people waited, some having set up small tents and cook fires in anticipation of a long evening. Dr. Harrington completed his pre-sunset examination of Eleanor, noting with interest that her pulse was less elevated than in previous weeks, despite the added pressure of so many observers. "You seem calmer today," he remarked, returning his stethoscope to his bag. "I'm still afraid," Eleanor admitted, "but also curious. Part of me wants to know what will happen." Dr. Wilson, a younger man with keen eyes and a methodical manner, introduced himself to Eleanor. "I've brought some additional equipment to measure certain physiological responses during your episode," he explained, indicating a leather case of instruments. "With your permission, I'd like to take a small sample of the blood that appears, to examine under a microscope." Eleanor looked to her parents, who nodded their assent. "If it helps understand why this is happening, then yes." As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, a hush fell over the gathered observers. Outside, the crowd had grown silent as well, all eyes fixed on the Blackwood house as if its walls might suddenly turn transparent. In the parlor, Eleanor sat in her chair, her parents standing protectively on either side. Dr. Harrington and Dr. Wilson positioned themselves close enough to observe and collect samples, while Reverend Collins and Professor Whitman prepared to transcribe whatever Latin phrases might emerge. The photographer, Mr. Davis, adjusted his camera one final time, preparing a magnesium flash that would illuminate the room at the critical moment. 2 minutes to sunset, Dr. Harrington announced, consulting his pocket watch. Eleanor closed her eyes, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. The familiar pressure was already building behind her eyes, intensifying with each passing second. 1 minute. Outside, someone began to sing a hymn, "Amazing Grace," and others quickly joined in. The sound drifted through the open windows, surrounding Eleanor with its simple, profound plea for divine mercy. "Here it comes," Thomas whispered, as the sun touched the horizon, casting its final crimson rays across his daughter's pale face. As before, the transformation began precisely at the moment of sunset. Eleanor's back arched, her face tilted upward, and the first drops of blood appeared at the corners of her eyes. But this time, there was a new development. The blood flowed more profusely, running in steady rivulets down her cheeks and neck. "Pulse increasing rapidly," noted Dr. Wilson, his fingers pressed to Eleanor's wrist. "Body temperature elevated." The Latin began, but unlike the previous Sundays, Eleanor's voice was stronger, more resonant, filling the small parlor with its authority. "Veni, Creator Spiritus, mentes tuorum visita, impli superna gratia quae tu creasti pectora." "Come, Creator Spirit," translated Professor Whitman, writing furiously. It's the ancient hymn to the Holy Spirit, dating back to the 9th century. The photographer triggered his flash, the sudden explosion of light causing several observers to flinch. The magnesium flare illuminated Eleanor's blood-streaked face in stark relief, capturing for posterity the moment when her recitation reached its peak intensity. Dr. Wilson carefully collected samples of the blood on small glass slides, his scientific curiosity evident in his focused expression. "The flow is consistent with tears," he murmured, "but the volume is far greater than normal tear production could account for." For 7 minutes, the pattern held, Eleanor bleeding, praying, and swaying gently in her trance-like state. But as the last sliver of sun disappeared, something changed. Instead of immediately losing consciousness as she had in previous episodes, Eleanor continued speaking for nearly 30 seconds after sunset, her voice rising and falling in what sounded like a desperate plea. Then, with a final phrase, "Libera nos a malo," "Deliver us from evil," she collapsed forward, blood still flowing freely from her eyes. "Eleanor!" Margaret cried, rushing to support her daughter. Dr. Harrington quickly checked her pulse. "It's racing but strong. This extended episode seems to have exhausted her more than previous ones." Slowly, Eleanor regained consciousness, her blue eyes focusing with difficulty on the concerned faces surrounding her. "What happened?" she asked weakly. "Did I say something different?" "Yes," Professor Whitman confirmed, reviewing his notes. The content shifted from scripture to liturgical prayer, specifically an ancient invocation for divine protection and deliverance. "And you continued past sunset," Reverend Collins added, his expression grave. "The pattern is evolving." Outside, the crowd had fallen silent upon seeing the flash of the camera. Many were kneeling in prayer, some weeping openly. When Thomas Blackwood emerged on the porch to inform them that the event had concluded, several pressed forward, begging for details or even a glimpse of Eleanor. "Please," Thomas implored, raising his hands. "My daughter needs rest. Whatever you may have come to see or believe, remember that she is a child, not a spectacle." Most respectfully withdrew, though some lingered, hoping for a second manifestation, or perhaps just to be near what they perceived as a divine presence. Among them was a thin man with intense eyes who watched the house with particular interest, making notes in a small book concealed in his palm. Inside, the scientific and theological discussions continued late into the night, long after Eleanor had been cleaned and put to bed. Dr. Wilson examined the blood samples under his portable microscope, comparing them with a sample of Eleanor's normal blood taken earlier that day. "It appears to be ordinary human blood," he reported with evident disappointment. "No unusual cellular structures or foreign elements that I can detect with this equipment. I'd like to take samples back to Indianapolis for more thorough analysis." Professor Whitman had been reviewing his transcriptions of Eleanor's Latin recitations across all 3 documented episodes. "There's a progression here," he observed, "from simple prayer to gospel text to liturgical invocation. If this pattern continues, I would expect next Sunday's content to be even more complex, perhaps moving into theological exposition or prophetic utterance." "But what does it mean?" Thomas asked, his voice weighted with parental concern. "Is my daughter being given these words by God, or is something else happening to her?" Dr. Harrington had been unusually quiet, contemplating the evening's events with a troubled expression. "There's another possibility we haven't fully considered," he said finally. "One that bridges the medical and the miraculous." All eyes turned to him expectantly. "Eleanor may be experiencing something called cryptomnesia, hidden memory. It's a phenomenon where knowledge absorbed at some point in the past resurfaces during altered states of consciousness, even though the individual has no conscious recollection of having learned it." "But Eleanor has never studied Latin," Margaret objected. "How could she be recalling something she never learned?" "Perhaps she was exposed to it without your knowledge," Dr. Wilson suggested. "Church services, overheard conversations, a book left open. The human mind is capable of absorbing and retaining far more information than we consciously process." Reverend Collins shook his head. "That might explain simple phrases but not extended, grammatically perfect recitations of ancient texts, and it certainly doesn't explain the bleeding." "No, Dr. Tew," Harrington agreed. "The bleeding remains medically anomalous, but if we consider these episodes as a form of stigmata, a physical manifestation of spiritual experience, then perhaps the 2 phenomena are connected in ways our separate disciplines cannot fully comprehend." The discussion continued until the oil lamps burned low, theories proposed and debated without resolution. What all agreed upon was the need for continued observation and documentation. Whatever was happening to Eleanor Blackwood, medical anomaly, divine visitation, or something yet undefined, it was progressing with each episode, following a pattern that suggested purpose rather than random pathology. As the last of the visitors departed, promising to return the following Sunday, Margaret checked on her sleeping daughter one final time. Eleanor lay peacefully, her face cleaned of blood, looking like any ordinary child lost in dreams. But beneath her closed eyelids, her eyes moved rapidly, as if watching scenes invisible to all but her. "What are you seeing, my child?" Margaret whispered, smoothing a strand of hair from Eleanor's forehead. "And where is it leading you? I invite you to leave a comment sharing a time when you witnessed something that seemed beyond logical explanation, a moment that made you question the boundaries between science and faith. Your experience might resonate with others here who've had similar encounters with the unexplainable." As October deepened toward winter, Eleanor's Sunday episodes continued with alarming regularity. Each week brought subtle changes: longer duration, more profuse bleeding, increasingly complex Latin recitations that moved from biblical texts to obscure theological treatises. By the fifth Sunday, Dr. A. Wilson had brought a stenographer to transcribe every word, building a comprehensive record that he later translated with Professor Whitman's assistance. What emerged was astonishing. Eleanor was delivering, in perfect sequence, portions of rare medieval commentaries on the nature of faith, suffering, and divine revelation. Some passages matched texts housed only in seminary libraries or private ecclesiastical collections, works a frontier girl could never have encountered. The crowd of observers had stabilized at around 200 people each Sunday, coming from as far as Chicago and St. Louis. Thomas had reluctantly constructed a small platform outside their home where Eleanor could be seated during her episodes, allowing more witnesses while maintaining a respectful distance. The donations offered by these pilgrims, for many now considered them religious journeys, had become the family's primary income. The farm largely neglected as they managed Eleanor's growing notoriety. But it was on the sixth Sunday, as the first snow of winter dusted the Indiana countryside, that the pattern shifted dramatically. Eleanor's episode began as usual at sunset, blood flowing from her eyes, Latin phrases emerging in that same measured voice. But halfway through, she suddenly switched to English, speaking in an accent none of her family recognized, crisp, educated, with hints of Boston formality. "My name is Father Thomas Ignatius Wright, ordained in the year of our Lord 1783 at the Seminary of St. Mary in Baltimore. I came to this territory in 1792, carrying with me the sacred texts entrusted to my care by Bishop Carroll, manuscripts rescued from the libraries of Europe during times of persecution." The crowd fell silent, even the usual sounds of shuffling feet and whispered conversations ceasing entirely. Eleanor, still bleeding from her eyes, continued in this unfamiliar voice. "I established a mission near what is now called Millfield, working among the settlers and native peoples. When fever swept through the region in the winter of 1798, I remained to tend the sick. As death approached, I feared the knowledge contained in my manuscripts would die with me. I buried the text beneath the stone altar of my small chapel, praying that God would someday reveal their location to a worthy vessel." Dr. Harrington leaned toward Reverend Collins. "Is there any record of such a mission in this area?" The minister shook his head. "Not that I'm aware of. The Presbyterian Church was the first established congregation in Millfield, founded in 1832. Eleanor's borrowed voice continued. "The chapel stands in a clearing surrounded by 7 oak trees, near where 2 streams meet to form a larger river. A stone bearing the Jesuit cross marks the path. The knowledge contained in these texts must not be lost. It speaks of the coming trials of faith, of a darkness that will test the church in years to come." With these words, Eleanor's episode concluded, 7 minutes exactly from when it had begun. But instead of collapsing forward as had become usual, she simply closed her eyes, the blood ceasing its flow, her breathing returning to normal within seconds. When she opened her eyes, there was a new awareness in them, recognition rather than confusion. "I remember," she said softly, looking at the stunned faces surrounding her. "I remember what I said." This development created immediate excitement among the observers. Dr. Wilson rushed forward with his notebook. "Eleanor, can you tell us more about this Father Wright, or the location of the chapel he described?" But Margaret intervened, wrapping a protective arm around her daughter. "That's enough for today. She needs rest." The crowd dispersed slowly, buzzing with speculation about the implications of Eleanor's latest pronouncement. Was she channeling the spirit of a long-dead priest? Had she somehow accessed historical knowledge through some unexplained faculty? And most intriguingly, did a cache of ancient religious texts actually lie buried somewhere in the forests surrounding Millfield? That evening, after Eleanor had been settled in her room, an unusual visitor arrived at the Blackwood home. William Clark, the county's most respected historian, had traveled from the county seat upon hearing reports of Eleanor's latest revelation. "I believe I can shed some light on this matter," he explained, accepting a cup of coffee from Margaret. "I've spent decades collecting accounts of early settlement in this region, including ecclesiastical records that never made it into official histories." From his satchel, Clark produced a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. This was part of the personal papers of Bishop John Carroll, the first Catholic bishop of the United States. In it, he mentions commissioning a Father Thomas Wright to establish a mission in the Western Territories in 1791. Reverend Collins, who had remained to discuss the day's events, leaned forward with interest. "Does it mention his fate?" Clark nodded solemnly. "There's a brief note dated spring of 1799, indicating that word had reached Baltimore of Father Wright's death during a winter fever outbreak. No further details were recorded, and apparently, the mission was abandoned." Dr. Harrington, who had also stayed behind, exchanged meaningful glances with Reverend Collins. This corroborates specific details from Eleanor's message, information she could not possibly have known through conventional means. "There's more," Clark continued, turning to another document in his collection. Early land surveys from 1820 make reference to the ruins of a small stone structure near the confluence of what are now called Black Creek and Miller's Stream, about 4 miles northeast of here. The surveyor noted unusual carvings on some of the stones but didn't elaborate. Thomas Blackwood had been listening intently, his weathered face betraying the internal struggle between skepticism and wonder that had characterized these past weeks. "Are you suggesting we should look for this chapel? Dig up whatever might be buried there?" "I believe it warrants investigation," Clark replied carefully. "If nothing else, it would either validate or disprove the historical accuracy of Eleanor's statements. From a scholarly perspective alone, the discovery of early mission documents would be significant." "And from a spiritual perspective," added Reverend Collins, "if Eleanor is indeed receiving these revelations through divine providence, we may have a duty to follow where they lead." Eleanor, who had been presumed asleep upstairs, suddenly appeared in the doorway of the parlor. "I can find it," she said simply. "I can see it in my mind now. The clearing, the 7 oaks, the stone altar. I know the way." The adults turned to her in surprise, Margaret rising to guide her daughter back to bed. "You need to rest, Eleanor. We can discuss this tomorrow." But Eleanor stood firm, a new confidence evident in her bearing. "Every Sunday, I lose part of myself to these episodes. For weeks, I've been a passive vessel, speaking words I couldn't remember, feeling my body used for purposes I didn't understand. Now, for the first time, I remember. I have clarity. Please, let me use it while it lasts." Dr. Harrington studied her with professional interest. "This retention of memory represents a significant change in the pattern. Eleanor, how much do you recall of the presence that spoke through you today?" She considered the question carefully. "It wasn't like someone else taking over my body. It was more like remembering something I'd always known but had forgotten. I could feel his dedication, his fear that something precious would be lost forever. His emotions, not just his words," Professor Whitman noted, making a quick entry in his ever-present journal. "Yes," Eleanor confirmed. "And I could see through his eyes, the chapel as it was when he knew it, the manuscripts he protected, Latin words on parchment, illuminated with gold and colors, beautiful and ancient." A lengthy discussion ensued, continuing late into the night. The possibility of finding tangible historical evidence connected to Eleanor's episodes was too compelling to dismiss. Eventually, a plan was formed. A small expedition would set out the following morning, with Eleanor guiding them based on her newly retained memories. Thomas insisted on strict limitations. Only Dr. Harrington, Reverend Collins, historian Clark, and himself would accompany Eleanor. Margaret would remain behind to manage the inevitable curious visitors who had taken to appearing daily at their farm. The matter would be kept private until they determined whether there was anything to discover. Dawn broke clear and cold the next morning. A thin layer of frost covered the ground as the small party set out on horseback, Eleanor riding double with her father. She led them confidently, navigating without hesitation through woodlands and across streams, as if following a map visible only to her. "It's remarkable," Clark commented quietly to Dr. Harrington as they rode. "She's taking us along game trails and natural passages that don't appear on any survey maps I've studied. Yet they're clearly the most direct route." After nearly 2 hours of steady travel, they reached a point where two streams converged. Eleanor pointed to a weathered stone half buried in the embankment, its surface bearing the faint outline of a cross with additional symbols at its base. "The Jesuit cross," Reverend Collins confirmed, examining the carving. "With the IHS monogram. This matches the description exactly." Eleanor urged them forward with growing excitement. "It's just ahead, through